Good evening. Good evening. If everybody could sit down, we're going to go ahead and begin the plenary session. I'd like to welcome you here. I'll be the chair of the plenary session this evening, but I was not its organizer, and I would like to thank those who did organize it, who are program co-chairs, namely Andrea Woody, Dave Kaiser, and Janet Brown, if they could stand up and acknowledge them. This session is a joint session of the History of Science Society and the PSA, and also sponsored by IUHPS. And what the co-chairs had in mind was to take advantage of the year, of the fact that it's the 50th anniversary of Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolution, to talk about what the book has meant to our fields. It's an interesting book to think about in relation to history of science and philosophy of science, as it was written by someone who is not formally trained in either field, and yet it has had a profound impact on both of our fields in different ways, and also for different generations. And I think that the History of Science Society Executive Office did a brilliant job of capturing this in the two alternative covers for this year's program. For those of you of my generation, this is the real structure. For those of you who are somewhat younger, it's this book here. Interestingly, this was the most cited book in the humanities and social sciences in the 1970s and 80s. As Dave Kaiser has pointed out to me, it was more cited at that time than the works of Foucault, Marx, Heidegger, or Derrida. In terms of its influence, it's probably the most important book that's ever come out of our fields, and it continues to have tremendous ramifications intellectually and pedagogically. So our panelists tonight will shed light on where this book came from and also why it had the impact that it did. So without further ado, I'll introduce our first speaker. Each of the speakers will give a talk for up to 20 minutes. And we have a nice mixture of people bringing historical and philosophical perspectives. Joel Isaac, who will speak first, is a lecturer in the history of modern political thought at the University of Cambridge and the fellow of Christ College. He obtained his PhD in 2006 and works on the history of American philosophy and social science in the 20th century. His book, highly relevant to tonight's session, is Making the Human Sciences from Parsons to Kuhn. It came out earlier this year from Harvard University Press and is presumably on sale in our book exhibit. So welcome, Joel.
Thank you for the introduction, Angela. I'm going to organize my remarks around a question that the young Thomas Kuhn strove to answer as he developed the ideas presented in The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. The question is, what do you do if you want to be a philosopher but cannot or do not wish to engage in the kind of professional training that makes you, in the modern academy, a philosopher? Framed slightly differently, the question amounts to this. What do you do if you want to speak to large philosophical issues like the nature of truth and the foundations of empirical knowledge, but are compelled to use other languages to do so, those of history, say, or of psychology or pedagogy? How then do you work the materials at your disposal into a configuration that will be of philosophical significance? My purpose in this short talk is to show that some of the twists and turns we see in Kuhn's road to structure can be explained as the result of Kuhn's attempts to solve the problems posed by just these questions. In particular, I shall argue that Kuhn's encounter with the case method of pedagogy at Harvard University was decisive in defining his responses. In the summer of 1943, as World War II reached a critical pass, Kuhn turned 21 and was on the cusp of taking up a position at Harvard's Radio Research Laboratory, one of the large-scale labs devoted to the development of radar technology for use in the war effort. By this point, Kuhn's plan to major in physics as a Harvard undergraduate had been set aside as he was conscripted into a compressed wartime program in electrical engineering. Brooding on his future prospects, Kuhn admitted in a letter to a close family member that he felt as if, and I'm quoting here, that he felt, if anything, younger than before, that is, further from any satisfactory creative, intellectual, or social functionings, not freer from responsibility. Referring to an earlier letter, which would appear to have discussed his hopes for a career, Kuhn confessed that the dreaming goes on. I lean, in short, increasingly toward the academic and to philosophy of and through science rather than to pure physics. But I am too far from knowing where it will end to waste your time here. Philosophy of and through science. That phrase neatly captured Kuhn's challenge on the road to structure. The product of progressive schooling and an unusual undergraduate physicist in also being active in Harvard's literary societies, Kuhn had wanted pure physics to open up issues of wider philosophical import. Instead, he had found himself getting something like the opposite of that from his crash course in electrical engineering. But Kuhn returned from the war, still clinging to his unformed aim to access philosophical insights through an understanding of the scientific enterprise. In the immediate post-war years, Kuhn's inclination toward philosophy of and through science led to a dalliance, albeit short-lived, with professional philosophy. At the very outset of his graduate training in physics, in the autumn of 1945, Kuhn, already hedging his bets, was given permission to take undergraduate philosophy courses. This experiment, as many of you will know, was swiftly curtailed. As Kuhn later recollected in somewhat vivid terms, he felt he had no clear point of access to the discipline of philosophy. Enter James Bryant Conant and the Harvard General Education Program. As someone tutored in both extremes of mid-century American pedagogy, the progressive tradition and wartime intensive training, Kuhn was already interested, by the end of the war, in the need for the redesign of science instruction. When asked by the Harvard Alumni Bulletin in 1945 to offer a recent undergraduate's perspective on the university's famous report on general education, Kuhn produced an opinion piece that focused primarily on the tension between specialist training and liberal education, as this was registered in the student experience of what were called distribution courses, required courses taken in addition to the major. By the time Conant asked Kuhn to prepare a case study on 17th century mechanics for his general education course, Natural Sciences 4, the disillusioned young physicist and philosopher Mankey was ready to find in his pedagogical brief a philosophical vocation. The Harvard General Education Program offered Kuhn a space in which to pursue his version of philosophy after both professional physics and orthodox philosophy had led him, he felt, into dead ends. Kuhn eventually became an assistant professor of general education at Harvard and taught in the field before departing for Berkeley in 1956. The foundation for Kuhn's revelation of the philosophical importance of pedagogy was laid by the distinction he had already made in his response to the General Education Report. As Kuhn came to see the matter in the late 1940s, there was a critical difference between how science should be taught to would-be specialists in a field and the way the central ideas and methods of experimental science ought to be taught to non-specialists, to those who were studying science in a general education program. For the specialist, the techniques of dogmatic initiation would have to serve the textbook exercises and laboratory demonstrations through which neophytes were socialized into a regime of normal science. In general education in science, however, the substitute for the specialist's pedagogical toolkit for Kuhn and his mentor Conant was the case history. As is well known, many of the cases employed in Conant's and later Kuhn's general education course, Natural Sciences 4, were later written up and published in 2 volumes as the Harvard Case Histories in Experimental Science, published together for the first time in 2 volumes in 1957. Each of the case histories were designed to reveal what Conant described as the evolution of a new conceptual scheme in a particular research tradition. Students being taught this material would acquire not new technical skills or a comprehensive body of knowledge. Rather, the case histories would develop their sense of the practical wisdom according to which scientists themselves could see, even when looking outside of their areas of specialization, the stakes involved in a certain project, or why one proposal for research was more promising than another. Importantly, this connection between case studies and mature judgment in practical affairs had been the motif of the development of the so-called case system of pedagogy at Harvard during the decades after Christopher Columbus Langdell first introduced it in the law school in the 1870s. At the time Conan took up the case method in general education, immediately after World War II, it was already being employed both in the Harvard Business School and in the college by Conan's uncle, the biochemist and Pareto disciple L.J. Henderson. Kuhn adopted Conan's case system wholesale and noted that the case method was, and I'm quoting Kuhn here, not an economical approach to science teaching, which was why it was quite properly omitted from standard science courses. This way of framing the difference between specialist and general education reaffirmed another and connected emerging distinction of Kuhn's. A distinction between the mechanisms of professional training on the one hand and the wider values and commitments that such training obscured from the trainee scientist on the other. Textbooks and practical instruction animated science as a vocational enterprise, but case histories, Kuhn believed, were needed to call attention to the creative revisions of conceptual schemes that defined scientific revolutions. The latter, of course, were the bread and butter of a general education in science. We would do well to note here Kuhn's initial assumption that the case method was something used to hone the practical wisdom, the strategic nous of men of affairs, and this was needed to grapple with the challenges of public life. Exposure to natural sciences 4 was designed to give future generals and legislators and philanthropists a whiff of the kind of intuitive know-how that came to scientists only after they had become masters in their fields or across several fields. In contrast, the scientists had to acquire this practical wisdom not through the study of cases, but through the grind of thorough training and years of hack work in the laboratory. So Kuhn didn't yet see how the case method could say anything useful about the constitution of scientific knowledge itself. What gave him the idea that the history of science could in fact hold lessons for philosophy was his arrival at the conclusion that the case method wasn't just for the science-averse sophomores. Rather, Kuhn came to see that the method could account for the durability and cumulative character of ordinary specialist scientific research. Finding a way to redeploy the case method in this fashion provided Kuhn with a path into a theory of scientific knowledge, and thereby into philosophy. And in the time that remains for my talk, I'll briefly reconstruct this development in Kuhn's thinking. Let's begin with the connection between pedagogy and philosophy. In each of the steps on the road to structure, textbooks and the necessarily blinkered nature of professional training in science played for Kuhn an important but subtly shifting role. Very soon after Kuhn began his stint in the Society of Fellows in 1948, he started to translate his convictions regarding the pedagogical function of textbooks in specialist education into a philosophical critique of attempts to, these are Kuhn's words, formalize or logicize scientific knowledge. Readers of Structure will know that when Kuhn undertook to criticize positivist philosophies of science, like operationism and logical empiricism, he did so not through systematic assessments of these positions, but rather by consistently associating them with the textbook vision of science as a static, logically interrelated set of concepts and laws. The difficulty Kuhn had with these philosophical positions, to the rather limited extent he discussed them in Structure, was that they were epistemologies of the textbook. By contrast, everything Kuhn had learned in thinking about a general education in science pointed to the significance of non-formalizable elements in shaping the actual process of research and discovery. These were elements that were especially visible in moments of rapid conceptual change within a tradition of experimentation, and the study of case histories provided an ideal means of studying these moments of crisis and transformation. More than a decade before Structure was published, Kuhn was in the habit of associating textbooks with formalization programs in the philosophy of science. In one of the earliest and unpublished outlines for Structure, likely written in the late 1940s, Kuhn attacked the treatment of scientific theories as logical calculi or mechanical operations, but drew his reflections to a conclusion by observing that, and I'm quoting here, textbooks represent a relatively logicized form of language and were thus the root of the philosophical error represented by the formalism of contemporary philosophy of science. For the Kuhn of the late 1940s and early 1950s, the antithesis of textbook science was what he called creative science, understood by Kuhn as the actual process of scientific research when seen in dynamic motion. From the perspective of the research process itself, preconceptions, conceptual schemes, and ideological commitments were central to inquiry, even though these could not be captured by the textbook view. The ideological framework revealed in creative science was exactly what the case histories given in general education science courses were designed to uncover and to illuminate. But this meant that thinking in cases would be useful only for explaining what kinds of general things scientists knew, but not the crucial philosophical problem of how they came to know it. Textbooks were no more than operation manuals containing instructions on how, through mechanical procedures, to arrive at valid beliefs. This was the basis of Kuhn's identification of positivist philosophy of science with textbook science. All of this left the case method more or less where Conant wanted it in the history of science. It delivered a general sense of the tactics and strategies of science, but it was in no sense the key to understanding the foundations of scientific knowledge itself. The precise character of this knowledge was something that could only be fully grasped, even if only implicitly, by those trained to professional standard in a scientific field. By definition, as Kuhn himself had insisted when he began teaching on Natural Sciences 4, the case method used to teach non-specialists could never also be used to train specialists themselves. During the 1950s, however, Kuhn slowly did take the pedagogy of the case method and produce an account of thinking with exemplars that underpinned not just his discussions of the practice of normal science, but also, of course, eventually in Structure, his explanation of the cycles of crisis, revolution, and the return to normal science. And he got to Structure, I think, by taking one crucial intermediate step. This involved the claim that textbooks were more than sets of instructions. They also had an ideological function. And once Kuhn came to insist on this, it became impossible for him to keep textbook science and creative science apart. Once this boundary was breached, in turn, Kuhn was able to see how the case method could be used to construct a theory of scientific knowledge. And I'll describe, in closing, how this process played out. In the early to mid-1950s, Kuhn's understanding of the efficacy of professional education was becoming increasingly sociological. Some of this was already evident in Kuhn's Lowell lectures of 1951, as when he claimed that the predispositions that conditioned inquiry had social sources. Responding in 1952 to an invitation from the physicist and philosopher Philip Frank to participate in a study group on the sociology of science, Kuhn proclaimed that, and I'm quoting here, in 20th century Western science, socially conditioned, implicit professional faiths have assumed many of the roles in the guidance of research and the acceptability of scientific theories, which religions and metaphysical systems played in the physical science of the 17th century. As Kuhn saw it, and again I'm quoting here, this professional consensus has important bearing upon the problems which a scientist considers worth attacking, the experiments which he employs to resolve his problems, and also on the various logical and experimental criteria demanded of a valid scientific argument. Similarly, when Kuhn sent his editor an informal prospectus for Structure in 1953, he emphasized in contrast to the formal content of a theory, the functions of a theory as a professional ideology for the practicing scientist. It was the purpose of textbooks and dogmatic formal induction into a tradition of experimental science to inculcate this professional ideology in new initiates in the field. Kuhn was nevertheless still inclined to mark off the creative imagination from the science of the textbook, but this radical disjuncture between ideology-driven ordinary science and the creative imagination would collapse as Kuhn moved during the late 1950s to identify the essential tension between dogma and innovation in scientific research. The cause of this collapse was precisely the notion that ideology rested on consensus on rules or shared beliefs or value commitments. Even as Kuhn began to speak in his drafts for structure of the paradigms involved in textbook-based pedagogy, he continued to believe that what those paradigms delivered to the initiate were common values and beliefs. As late as the summer of 1960, when he completed the penultimate draft of structure, Kuhn was still labeling his discussion of the sociology of professionalization, normal science as rule-determined. Revealingly, Chapter 5 of the published edition of Structure, The Priority of Paradigms, was not in the penultimate draft, and nor were any of the explicitly philosophical passages, notably the discussion of Wittgenstein that this Chapter 5 contained. At this juncture, however, in 1960, Kuhn was eager to confess that his earlier view that periods of normal science were periods of consensus, during which the entire scientific community agreed about the rules of the game, was very probably wrong. His highlighting of the role that standard textbook examples and laboratory demonstrations played in forging agreement had revealed that the number of rules that can be adduced by such study never seems sufficient to define the puzzles that scientists normally undertake or to restrict scientific attention to their pursuit. Although Kuhn had nothing to say at this stage in the drafting process about Wittgenstein and the philosophy of language, he did something more revealing. Having held textbook and creative science apart for the better part of a decade, just as he had the methods of specialist and generalist training in science, he now implied that the standard samples and applications given in scientific training regimes played a more subtle role in forming the scientist's mental set than merely hammering in consensus on rules and standards. Instead, the model puzzle solutions found in textbooks and practical demonstration possessed some of the pedagogic properties of the exemplary cases hitherto reserved for studying moments of creative ferment in science in the general education program. These exemplars honed the judgments of students, their facilities in practical reasoning in a given area, in such a way that their judgments on salient problems and appropriate solutions to those problems would tend to converge, even in the absence of explicit agreement on theoretical or methodological fundamentals. It was because they learned in this case-based manner, Kuhn argued, that scientists can so regularly agree in their evaluations of particular problems and particular solutions without manifesting any similar agreement about the full set of rules that appear to underlie their judgment. This is the view that underpins Kuhn's explanation of the stability of judgment in normal science. This was exactly the sort of practical wisdom about the nature of the scientific research process that Conant's case histories in experimental science were supposed to inculcate in non-scientists. Moreover, the training in this sort of non-mechanical practical judgment had defined the case method in teaching at Harvard for almost a century, as I've already noted. But Kuhn had, one might say, democratized the practical wisdom that Conant, and behind him Henderson and the grand professors of the business school, had wished to cultivate. For them, this was a capacity that was exercised only by, in effect, men of affairs, men of mature judgment who would be called upon to decide the fate of proposals and projects in fields other than their own. They would be foundation officers, politicians, business leaders, and science administrators with purview over other disciplines. Now, Kuhn was saying that just the same capacity was cultivated by the textbook itself in the process of socialization into a normal science. A person might spend their whole career buried deep in problems relevant only within that narrow specialism, and yet also manifest the same practical wisdom concerning what counted as good or bad science that Conant reserved for the men of affairs. And it was learning by exemplars, by cases, that allowed them to do this. For Kuhn, naturally, this transmutation of the case method mattered less than the fact that it allowed him a way into the philosophy of science. One of the ways he got there, as I hope to have shown, was not quite through science itself, but through the demands of thinking about the differences between specialist and general education in science. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Alan Richardson. He is professor of philosophy and a member of the Science and Technology Studies graduate program at the University of British Columbia. As a founder and past president of the International Society for the History of Philosophy of Science, or HOPOS, Richardson has described his interest in philosophy of science as a field of philosophical endeavor in the era from Kant to the present. Rather narrow definition, I think. His book, Carnap's Construction of the World, appeared in 1997, and he has since published an essay on Kuhn and logical positivism, to which he devotes significant interest, in the Cambridge Companion to Logical Empiricism. Thank you, Alan.
Thank you, Angela, and thank you all for coming, and thank several of you for organizing this session. It's already been very interesting. You didn't give them my title, though, which was my first joke. You need to know the title of my paper. My title is From Troubled Marriage to Uneasy Co-Location, Thomas Kuhn, Epistemological Revolutions, Romantic Narratives in HPS. As I spent about the last 6 weeks trying to figure out what to say here today, I came increasingly clearly to the conclusion that I should begin with a bit of advice to younger scholars. Philosophers are good at giving advice. Here it is. If someone offers you the opportunity to speak briefly about the one figure about whom everyone in your proposed audience has strong and settled opinions, think at least twice before you say yes. But here I am, speaking about Thomas Kuhn, happy to express my deep admiration for his work, but without, unlike the rest of the panel, I believe, without the fruits of significant new scholarly labor, and thus unable to tell you much of anything about his work that you don't already know. So, faced with this situation, allow me to shift focus from what I am doing here to what you are doing here, or rather, what we are doing here, or rather, what we are doing here. What goal might an almost unprecedented plenary session of our two societies have when that session is organized around a work of someone who must be acknowledged as one of the great figures in both the history of science and the philosophy of science, but whose legacy is not universally viewed as in the main positive, certainly not among philosophers of science. So allow me to place my cards on the table immediately. Every second year, the co-located meetings of HSS and PSA serve, as much as anything, as a sort of epitome or emblem of the, how can I say this delicately, underperformance of the late 1950s and 60s intellectual formation entitled History and Philosophy of Science. We all know how little traffic there is between the societies. Speaking as a former program chair for PSA, I can say that just on the side of the mechanics of scheduling, putting together this session represents the fruits of what must have been astonishing labor on the part of Andrea Woody, David Kaiser, and Janet Brown. Now, back in the 1970s, a number of philosophers of science, Ernie McMullen, Ron Geary, Dick Burian, and others, wondered out loud about the marriage of history and philosophy of science, and whether it was a good or indeed really a possible thing. Now, it's hard to imagine an odder metaphor to work within than this one, whether elaborated in a religious or a secular way, when considering either discipline formation or interdisciplinary research. With very few exceptions, among which I count Mary Domsky and Michael Dixon's likening of Michael Friedman's work to a marital aid in the title of their big book of Michael Friedman's work, reinvigorating the marriage between history and philosophy of science, or Lorraine Daston's suggestion in an essay replete with learned allusions to Shakespearean romance that after a dalliance with science and technology studies, history of science might well want to look up its old partner, philosophy of science, on Facebook. This talk has gone away. In the parlance of the 21st century, we might say that historians and philosophers of science are colleagues with potential benefits which, however, we lack interest and of which we do not often avail ourselves. Now, Kuhn's relations to the project of history and philosophy of science at the time of its institutionalization are indeed interesting. One could well argue that the structure made HPS. In America, the burgeoning project of history and philosophy of science acquired its blockbuster text, a book that everyone read, and that made HPS a project everyone in the academy knew at least a little about and respected at least a little bit. Of course, as Kuhn himself later reflected, the student radicals of the late 1960s misread the book as an expose of the authoritarian workings of scientific power, when in fact it was a description, indeed a celebration of authority and dogma, specifically within science, in which the motor of progress was puzzle solving, and authority and dogma were among the faces by which puzzle-solving traditions took hold, were elaborated in advance, and ultimately broke down. However, much as Kuhn made HPS, it could be argued made Kuhn. After all, to use McMullen's phrase in one of his last essays, annus mirabilis of HPS in America was 1960, the year of the founding of the departments at Pitt in Indiana and the center at BU, and thus by the time Kuhn's book actually came out, there was an institutionalized project in at least a few prominent places that was ready and able to take that book seriously. So if we wish to speak the language of a certain branch of science and technology studies, we could talk of the co-construction of Kuhn's intellectual prominence in the project of HPS. But however that may be, Kuhn himself was famously and pointedly dubious about at least some models of history and philosophy of science. In his 1968 lecture on the topic given at Michigan State and published later in The Essential Tension, this essay is a long meditation, written, interestingly, mainly from the point of view of graduate training and reflecting his own professorial experience in the HPS classroom, that posited a difference in interests, goals, reading habits, and so on between the historically and the philosophically minded of his students. In Kuhn's view, the budding philosophers in his classes were interested in the universal and the normative. They were interested in speaking the truth about what is always and everywhere the same in science, and in evaluating specific scientific interventions, say Cartesian physics or Darwinian biology, in light of those universals. The budding historians, on the other hand, were interested in the time-bound and the local aspects of the text in front of them. This all sounds very familiar. Kuhn ends the essay with a resounding rejection of the marriage plot and a more puzzling, given what he has said throughout the essay, invocation of active discourse. Quote, "I urge that history and philosophy of science continue as separate disciplines. What is needed is less likely to be produced by marriage than by active discourse." Kuhn's sensibilities about a difference of goals and interests between history of science and philosophy of science did not, in fact, arise from the hard experience of trying to give courses to both history and philosophy students, however much we can emphasize with Kuhn's plight in such a situation. They were well forged already in 1962 and are illustrated in the differences between Mary Hess's review of structure and Kuhn's own review of Hess's 1961 book, Forces and Fields, which book was concerned with the development of the field concept against the background of historical arguments about action at a distance. Hesse is one of the first, in her ISIS review of structure published in 1963, to use Kuhnian terminology to frame the significance of Kuhn's own book. The review concludes with the following sentences, quoting now from Hesse, "It cannot be disputed that this is the first attempt for a long time to bring historical insights to bear on the philosopher's account of science. And whatever the puzzles are that remain to be solved, Kuhn has at least outlined a new epistemological paradigm which promises to resolve some of the crises currently troubling empiricist philosophy of science. Its consequences will be far-reaching, unquote. Here we see the familiar and surely correct view that structure, by disrupting the image of science by which we are now possessed, disrupts philosophy of science, as Joel just telling us about, which, after all, is the place, according to structure, where that vision is codified. The textbook vision. Interestingly, Kuhn's own review in Sigma Chi of Hesse's book takes a very different approach. Kuhn praises the book for both its historical and philosophical concerns, and in so doing takes for granted that we, as readers of Hesse's book, as he does, know how to sort her concerns into the historical and the philosophical. After noting that Hesse explicitly frames her history of the conceptual development of the field as a criticism of logical empiricist doctrine, Kuhn writes the following, quoting now from Kuhn's review of Hesse. The explicitly philosophical dimension of Dr. Hesse's book is for me at least as rewarding as the explicitly historical, but the attempt to combine the two is a source of the book's main weakness. History and philosophy of science can do much to illuminate and stimulate one another. Dr. Hesse's book is a noteworthy attempt to prove the point, yet the writing of history differs from that of philosophy in its main concerns, values, and principles of organization, and Dr. Hesse has not always succeeded in reconciling the two. Unquote. So the very Kuhn who sought to alter the ground of philosophy of science by offering a role for history of science which would disrupt and replace the image of science by which we are now possessed, himself was able, in his reading practices, to keep the concerns and values of history and philosophy of science distinct. Now, I don't mean to present that as a cosmic mystery or a paradox or as an objection to Kuhn. I think one can begin to make sense of what Kuhn is on about here. And some of the phrases that Joel just gave us might pop up in your minds as I talk about this. What is interesting is that as we attempt to interpret Kuhn on this matter, it will turn out that the role for history in structure is more subtle than what most philosophers think the historical turn in philosophy of science was suggesting. Here's a conjecture regarding Kuhn's reading of Hesse, and then one regarding Kuhn's reading of Kuhn. These are conjectures. If you or one of your students is in need of a dissertation project in the history of philosophy of science, I'd suggest reading structure in light of Kuhn's reactions to various figures in the historical turn in order to tease out where he thinks the differences between his views and theirs lie. Here's how I think Kuhn is reading Hesse's book. Hesse begins in chapter 1 with a summary of current logical empiricist accounts of scientific theory and of bridge principles as the keys to the application of theory to the world of experience or of ordinary things. She notes several in-principle objections to such views, based largely on model theoretic considerations. She then introduces her own favored machinery for theorizing the application of theory to observable objects, machinery, philosophical machinery involving metaphor and various types of model to serve as bridges between theory and the world. She then goes to the history of the field concept to develop and to illustrate that machinery. I think she reads Kuhn's book the same way. The machinery of logical empiricism is insufficient to account for scientific development or progress, so we need the machinery, the Kuhnian machinery now, of paradigms, normal science, and so on to explain that progress. But, and here's my conjecture about Kuhn does not read his own book that way. He does not develop in principle objections to logical empiricism, then introduce new machinery, and then illustrate both the problems for logical empiricism and the solutions to those problems offered by his own machinery by giving historical examples. At least that's not the primary use of history in the book. Rather, you begin with the historiographic questions of what sorts of historical questions does the working historian need to answer in order to provide a coherent and explanatory narrative of some episode in the history of science. Then you notice that those very questions are not the questions that say, Logical empiricist distinctions like between discovery and justification would have suggested needed to be answered in the first place. History is not, on this view, primarily a source of evidence for or against a philosophy or of illustration of philosophical machinery. Rather, history of science as a practice, the writing of history, demands the formation of coherent and explanatory historical narratives, and the guidelines for the creation of those narratives themselves demand answers to different sorts of questions than the philosophical machinery would lead you to ask. In somewhat different words, for Kuhn, Hesse views history as a source of evidence for or against a philosophy of science. For Kuhn, the practice of history, the development of historical understanding itself, stands in contradiction to the sorts of concerns and the machinery for understanding science posited in logical empiricist philosophy of science, as he understands it, in the 1950s. Or in an anti-Lakatosian slogan, one might say, for Kuhn, history of science is itself rational reconstruction, in the sense that it must yield coherent and explanatory accounts of the facts, but one that operates on entirely different principles from those found in the philosophy of science of the day. I think that this conjecture, or some other in the vicinity, is interesting because if it is right, or is on the way to being right, then it does disrupt some circulating stories about the history of HPS. Thus, one circulating story about what I called a few minutes ago the underperformance of HPS is that actually it turned out to be pretty easy and not terribly interesting for philosophers to take on what the historical term asked them to. Thus, philosophers of science with either a few apologies for or explanations of why they had been talking about towers and shadows or black ravens and white shoes could acknowledge that, of course, philosophy of science needed to account for the facts of scientific development. Those facts are evidence for, or subject matter for, or evaluative matter for philosophy of science. On the view scouted above, that is not a sufficient response to Kuhn's position, which is about the incompatibility of the processes of historical and philosophical understanding. And I don't think I'm wholly off base in the conjecture about Kuhn's self-understanding. To illustrate this, let me return to the 1968 History of Science and Philosophy of Science essay and quote from the same final paragraph I quoted from before, a passage that might seem to fit oddly with both philosophers' understandings of themselves and lessons that historians have taken from Kuhn, that is, anti-rational reconstructionist stories. Here's quoting from Kuhn. About those processes by which theories develop and are evaluated, we know very little, and we shall not learn more until we learn properly to reconstruct selected theories of the past. As of today, the people taught to do that job are historians, not philosophers. Unquote. Why are they historians and not philosophers? Because philosophers have imbibed, this is Kuhn's story in 1968, have imbibed a general claim that theories are simply sets of laws, empirical generalizations, or higher-level explanatory laws that explain those empirical generalizations. But this illuminated for Kuhn neither the identity nor the function of theory in science. He emphasized throughout a form of theory holism, and in this essay especially a sort of theory universalism. That is, not only were the concepts of a given theory related to each other so that you couldn't atomize the theory into distinct semantic parts, but theory, whenever it appeared in science, which it always did, appeared in a totalizing form. The subject matter of science, all of it was constrained by theory. In his various attempts to work out the conceptual structure of theories, Kuhn returned again and again to holistic metaphors and functionalist language, trying to express how the same principles provided at once a vocabulary in which to speak meaningfully at all about nature, and at the same time expressed a specific set of claims that ruled, as it were, a priori with respect to nature so semantically circumscribed. Facts about Kuhn's own biography and an increased knowledge of neo-Kantian projects in philosophy of science suggest something both resonantly and problematically Kantian about such sensibilities. And there's an irony here also. Kuhn's remarks on the differences between the sensibilities of historians and philosophers of science are tempered by his own repeated insistence that the sensibilities of historians of science were themselves importantly forged or fostered by the work of neo-Kantian philosophers such as Ernst Cassirer and Emil Meyerson. If Kuhn had been less time-bound in his own understanding of philosophy, he might have seen that specifically the question of what made a narrative of the development of scientific knowledge a narrative of progress, of science, and of knowledge of nature was itself a prominent question in philosophy for well over 100 years after Kant's. Lest I be misunderstood here, the lesson here is not also zurück zu Kant, although that does feel good to say in a room full of several hundred people. The last thing I'd want to suggest is that history and philosophy of science have a marriage on the Kantian conception of marriage. Look it up if you don't know. The lesson is that if we'd like to be more than co-located colleagues, we might not only want to think about scientific understanding of nature, but also reflexively about the practices of historical understanding and of philosophical understanding of science. Then I think we'd have a lot to talk about. We probably should see each other more often, but not on the model of having a few dates and seeing how things work out. On the issue of work-life balance, the future of history and philosophy of science should be decidedly on the side of work. Thank you.
Our next speaker, I'm pleased to introduce, is Mary Jo Nye. She is the Horning Professor of the Humanities and Professor of History Emerita at Oregon State University in Corvallis. Her teaching and research has focused mainly on the history of the modern physical sciences, although she's also attended to issues of science and politics and philosophy of science. Her most recent book, Michael Polanyi and His Generation, Origins of the Social Construction of Science, was published by the University of Chicago Press last year. And lest I rob anybody of any jokes, I will read her title to you, which is in the program, On Tradition and Innovation Before and After Kuhn. Thanks, Mary Jo.
I'm sorry to report that my title is not a joke. I don't have Alan's talents in that realm. I'm very glad to be here, and it's very nice to see all of you here. And I appreciated the invitation to participate in this session. If I had happened to glance at Thomas Kuhn's new book, Structure of Scientific Revolutions, while browsing in a bookstore in 1962 as a college freshman, I likely would have seen nothing surprising in the title initially. I probably would have thought that the book had to do with scientific methodology and the way in which proper scientific method ensures the scientist's rejection of wrong ideas and the discovery of revolutionary new phenomena. Of course, I would have been wrong. In fact, Kuhn's title registered two bold assertions on the basis of case histories, as Joel has discussed, in the physical sciences. First, scientific history is a history of distinct ruptures, as in political history, and new ways of seeing the physical world are incommensurable with the systems they have destroyed. Secondly, bold assertion, there is a repetitive and predictable structure to scientific change, which in Kuhn's pithy terminology is one of normal science under a dominant paradigm, followed by accumulation of anomaly, then crisis and revolution. The outcome of the process is the result not just of empirical logic, but also of the psychology of conversion and the sociology of community. The Copernican revolution, the chemical revolution, the quantum revolution are among his exemplars. A few years before the publication of Structure, Kuhn outlined some of his main themes at a conference devoted to the identification of scientific talent. The Soviet launching of Sputnik had just triggered a panicked infusion of federal money into science education in the United States. And this 1959 conference at the University of Utah was one of many efforts to define and promote scientific creativity and achievement. Kuhn presented a paper titled The Essential Tension, Tradition and Innovation in Scientific Research. And he perhaps startled participants who were expressing the usual view at that time that the creative science eliminates all prejudice from the mind and cultivates divergent thinking from accepted opinion. This point of view coincided with the already popular critical empiricist philosophy of science of Karl Popper. It also corresponded with the well-known adage of Claude Bernard a century earlier that the scientist must leave his imagination in the coat room when entering the laboratory and put it on again only after recording experimental results. Kuhn's different view denied the heroic stereotype of objective scientific method in search of new and revolutionary discoveries. In contrast, said Kuhn, almost none of the research undertaken by even the greatest scientist is designed to be revolutionary. But on the contrary, normal research is a highly convergent activity based firmly upon a settled consensus acquired from scientific education and reinforced by subsequent life in the profession. Revolutionary shifts occur, he said, but they are rare, in part because of scientific pedagogy in mature science that teaches conformity to the textbook, again as emphasized by Joel, with exemplary problem solutions that show the student what problems matter and how to solve them. Science rests, Kuhn said, on a dogmatic initiation in a pre-established tradition of apprenticeship. Science produces innovations because of the ways in which the scientist's puzzle-solving activities reliably expand the matrix of scientific beliefs and occasionally call those beliefs into question, following the accumulation of anomalies that can no longer be ignored. The successful scientist lives in a community, he said, of essential tension between the double roles of traditionalist and iconoclast. Simply by offering this interpretation, Kuhn himself positioned himself as an iconoclast. I would like to emphasize this evening Kuhn's argument that the nature of scientific knowledge lies in what he variously called dogma, belief, or tradition, all of which sounds disturbingly like ideology, faith, and religion. Kuhn's insistence on scientific belief was not entirely new, but the 1 million copies of his book sold in his lifetime brought the notion a new audience. Kuhn drew brief attention in structure to the earlier description by the bacteriologist Ludwig Fleck of thought models and thought collectives that restrict what problems are deemed significant and what kinds of answers can be sought. Kuhn also cited the physical chemist Michael Polanyi for Polanyi's statements of the role in science of established beliefs and the importance of apprenticeship through which the scientist absorbs the tacit knowledge essential to future scientific practice. In Kuhn's view, however, Polanyi put too much emphasis on the individual scientist, the personal in Polanyi's terminology, and on the individual experience of conversion that can be likened to a change in gestalt. In contrast, Kuhn said that he wanted to emphasize the collective process in the scientific community by which innovation is recognized and legitimated. Reading Fleck, wrote Kuhn, made him realize that his own ideas about scientific tradition and scientific revolution needed to be set within a sociological account of the scientific community. At this time, the sociology of science in the United States was just emerging from its recent association with leftist Marxist alliances. Anti-Marxist views affected the reception in the United States in the 1930s of Boris Hessen's account of the social and economic origins of Newton's Principia, of J.D. Bernal's description of the social organization and social function of science, and Karl Mannheim's sociology of knowledge, all of which, nonetheless, got the attention of the young American sociologist Robert Merton, whose 1936 dissertation offered a powerful but non-Marxist interpretation of the social and economic aspects of scientific development in 17th century England. Merton's attitude toward Mannheim was especially important. Merton wrote a review for ISIS of the English translation of Mannheim's Ideology and Utopia, familiarizing himself in the process with Mannheim's arguments for the social determinants of what Mannheim called thought models in the social sciences. Merton noted Mannheim's exclusion of the natural sciences from analysis and suggested presciently that the sociology of scientific knowledge was a future task for sociologists once they had accomplished the project of empirically studying the institutions, norms and values, priority and reward systems, and disciplinary networks of the scientific community. It was this latter kind of sociology that Kuhn had in mind for better understanding the workings of natural science and its traditions of belief and practice. In a 1960 essay on the history of science for the International Encyclopedia for the Social Sciences, Kuhn noted past Marxist influences in the external study of non-intellectual aspects of scientific culture. But with some attention in this article to Merton and to sociologists such as Joseph Ben David and Warren Hagstrom, Kuhn suggested that the greatest challenge now facing the history of science profession was bringing together the so-called internal and external approaches. This is exactly what happened, of course, after the dust settled from early debates about structure. Several conferences this year have marked this anniversary of structure, as we're doing tonight. I have heard it said at these conferences that Kuhn's book, or at least at one of them, that Kuhn's book generated no Kuhnian research school, despite the fact that Kuhn taught and collaborated with later quite distinguished historians of science. It also has been argued that Kuhn's main personal interest lay in the history of ideas and in the philosophy of language and incommensurability, rather than in the study of scientific institutions and communities, much less the sociology of knowledge. Fair enough. Nonetheless, I think that Kuhn's call for a history of science that would combine what then were called the internal and external approaches was important, and Kuhn's evolving notion of the nature of paradigm and normal science as what he began calling a disciplinary matrix provided historians of science with a powerful tool. With that tool, they have studied and expanded the scope of the history of science by studying in great detail in different times and places the many ways in which scientific traditions in the natural sciences have been codified, transmitted, and transformed. Some of this work has seemed to undermine confidence in the integrity and reliability of science in ways that Kuhn, as well as Polanyi, Fleck, and Mannheim, certainly did not intend in their emphasis on what they saw as the constructive and stabilizing constraints of scientific tradition, dogmas, or thought models. Many of us remember or have read Stephen Brush's 1974 article in Science titled, "Should the History of Science Be Rated X?", which suggested that recent historians' accounts of the way that scientists behave might not provide a good model for science students. Among Brush's examples were recent articles on fudge factors in the work of scientific heroes such as Newton, Mendel, and Millikan. Here, as Kuhn had argued, were accounts of great heroes of science who resisted anomalies and discrepancies because of their committed theoretical beliefs. By the mid-1970s, the new field of social studies of science joined the Merton School in influencing the history of science. Whether in Paris or Edinburgh or Philadelphia, science studies paid attention to social determinants of scientific knowledge and its thought models. The science studies principle of impartiality demanded social explanation rather than rational explanation of widely accepted theories in the natural sciences, including the physical sciences. Rather than claiming that a theory is true or false, including its acceptance must be explained through understanding the motives and strategies of the producers of knowledge and of dominant social interest, an argument being made independently by the philosopher Michel Foucault for viewing disciplinary regimes in the social and human sciences. Was this line of scholarship also a reason to rate the history of science X? The notion that science is just belief, relatively independent of something like objective empiricism or convergent reality, could legitimate the arguments by science deniers that theories of evolutionary biology or climate change are scientific dogmas, beliefs, controlled by a power elite within scientific disciplines. When he was writing Structure in the heyday of World War II and post-Sputnik public support for science, Kuhn did not foresee such outcomes. Nor did he likely realize just how catchy his book title and his schemes of paradigms and revolutions might become during the 1960s political turmoil of civil rights, women's rights, anti-Vietnam War movements, and the Paris and Czech uprising of May '68. These political developments brought unexpected attention to Kuhn's book on revolutions, along with new commercial possibilities for Berkeley street vendors who began selling bumper stickers that read, "Subvert the dominant paradigm." Among historians of science, however, a surprising thing happened. Kuhn's notions of the dominant paradigm, sudden rupture, and discontinuity were undermined, I would argue, by decades of historical studies combining the so-called internal and external history that he highlighted as the challenge for the future. Post-Kuhn historians have built upon Kuhn's notion of tradition, but especially his definition of disciplinary matrices, to study in detail research groups in schools, laboratory and instruments, periodicals and textbooks, techniques of pedagogy, development of scientific lexicons, scientific responses to anomalies, and scientific controversies. The results, for example, in my field of the history of chemistry, have often undermined Kuhn's claims of sudden and incommensurable change. For example, historians have found the long century of Lavoisier's so-called revolution, which was one of Kuhn's primary exemplars, to be instead a period of small and gradual changes in chemistry, and to be a period characterized by continued use of old practices alongside new ones in chemical methods, theories, and languages. These kind of results in the history of the natural sciences tend to support the gradualist and evolutionary explanation of scientific change that Kuhn briefly broached at the very conclusion of Structure, at odds with the book's main argument. In his Rothschild lecture at Harvard in 1991, Kuhn may have surprised some people in his audience by saying that the episodes I once described as scientific revolutions are intimately associated with speciation that produces a variety of niches within which the practitioners of these various specialties practice their trade. Detailed historical studies of developments of physical chemistry, solid-state physics, molecular biology, and other so-called hybrid fields that have emerged alongside older disciplinary matrices seem to confirm his gradualist interpretation, as do many philosophical studies in the last decades. Our histories of science now differ greatly from those familiar to Thomas Kuhn at the time that he published Structure. For one thing, the histories are less heroic. For another, they rarely take the form of simply tracing materially and culturally independent or disembodied ideas. Our histories mostly are finely grained in their timelines and locales as we analyze the investigative pathways and social settings within which science has been practiced, and as we study the science's cultural meanings. Our histories also reflect recent changes in science. Big science has become even bigger. The numbers of women in the sciences have greatly increased, as have the number of non-European scientists working in the traditional Western bloc and outside that bloc. The assistants and technicians aiding scientists have become more numerous and more visible. the distinction between fundamental and applied science has become harder to make. Correspondingly, we have made these kinds of people visible in our histories of past science and have explained the social mechanisms that long made them absent or invisible, finding continuities between past and present that sometimes surprise us. In the end, I think that Kuhn's legacy is stronger than sometimes claimed, although not entirely as he might have wished it to be. It is ironic that the history of tradition, rather than revolution, became the legacy. The first excitement and the first dissent over structure centered on Kuhn's statement of the dogmatic character of scientific belief, which he incorporated into the notion of paradigm, and scientific revolution as a dramatic process of historical discontinuity between two incommensurable paradigms. Revolution was a catchword in the 1960s, but less so in the next couple of decades. As I have suggested briefly this evening, the next generation of historians of science after Kuhn mostly disconfirmed the thesis of rupture and discontinuity in favor of gradualism and continuity, as they restudied the so-called scientific revolutions and focused on the everyday practices and everyday scientists of what Kuhn called the tradition of normal science. The idea of the influence in science of tradition and belief is no longer heretical. For this we owe Kuhn and others a considerable debt for giving us conceptual tools that have expanded the history of science away from the heroic and into the ordinary practices of science, however fallible, but also committed its practitioners may be. Thank you.
Okay, our last talk this evening will be given by Paul Hoyningen-Huhn, who, like Thomas Kuhn himself, was trained in physics before turning his attention to philosophy. And in fact, that included a time visiting as a visiting scholar at MIT, working with Kuhn himself. From 1997, Hoyningen-Huhn has been professor and director of the Center for Philosophy and Ethics of Science at the Leibniz University of Hanover, Germany. His main research areas include the dynamics of scientific theory change, especially in Kuhn and Feyerabend, as well as interests in reduction and emergence and the ethics of science. And he's best known for his book, Reconstructing Scientific Revolutions, Thomas S. Kuhn's Philosophy of Science, which was published in 1993. His new book, which is entitled Systematicity, The Nature of Science, will appear soon with Oxford University Press. And as you can see, he's going to conclude our evening with a talk entitled, What is Uncontroversial About Kuhn?
Thank you very much for the organization. And, oops, I lost the cable. Okay, we'll fix that. It worked, so it should work again. Did it come back? It's coming back. It's coming back. Okay. It's okay. So, you saw my title, Most People React. That'll be a very short talk, right? Well, here's the outline. I give you the answer to the title question first, and the answer to the title question is, what is uncontroversial about Kuhn? Kuhn produced more confusion than any other 20th century philosopher of science or historian of science. Okay, the questions perhaps shamefully posed by some is now in your mind, look at your neighbor or at yourself, was Kuhn really a philosopher of science? That's the philosopher's question. And the other one is, was Kuhn really a historian of science? And the confusion begins to emerge. Here we are. All right. Quite some confusion exists about many topics that Kuhn brought up, and I'm just mentioning a few of them here. The context of discovery versus context of justification, People put down the book when they read that, what Kuhn wrote about, the context distinction, about paradigms, of course, and scientific progress, relativism, subjectivism, irrationality, and it was also mentioned already, internalism versus externalism in historiography, etc. Well, in this talk, I shall only treat one topic of that sort, and that's difficult enough. Can you guess it? Incommensurability. All right. Now, there are many different sources for the confusion about incommensurability, and again, I shall treat only 4 of them, interesting ones. One is Paul Feyerabend, the second one is incomparability, the third is self-refutation, and the fourth is world change. We heard it already in talks today. So let's start with the first source of confusion, Paul Feyerabend. Well, the reason is that Paul Feyerabend also introduced the concept of incommensurability in 1962, slightly but not insignificantly different from Kuhn's. I heard it today in a conversation that people at Princeton, was it, or at Berkeley created the Kuhn-Feyerabend figure. As one figure, they identified the two. At the time, it was not obvious, apparently, that the two different notions of incommensurability were in play there, but they were, if you look at the details. I shall not follow up these differences here, but I give you here a piece of mine, 3 biography, Kuhn, Feyerabend, and incommensurability. I note here, because my name is so difficult both to pronounce and to write, I'm using the Stanford notation of my name. That was invented by then graduate student Hasok Chang in the early 90s. He just said, we talk about HH. That's easier. Okay. There is proof, by the way, that Kuhn and Feyerabend did not talk very much about incommensurability, and here it is. You see them here, they sit next to each other, they look there, it's probably incommensurability, but they don't talk about it, and I'm waiting and watching, but they don't talk about it. Okay. Now to the next topic, which is also a sort of comedy, it's about incomparability. Well, incommensurability always, in all its uses, always means some sort of incomparability. And the common thesis that people derive from that is if paradigms or theories are incommensurable, theory choice cannot be rational because it cannot be based on a comparative evaluation. I even heard that today in some talks. That's the common thesis. However, one has to be very careful because now here I highlighted incommensurability means some sort of incomparability. It's not just, and it certainly not means absolute incomparability, because such a thing doesn't exist. You can always compare two things with each other. There's certainly always an aspect, its mode of being, or its length, or its weight, or its color, whatever it is. You can always compare two things. So absolute incommensurability doesn't exist. So what is it, what is Kuhn talking about? Well, and in general, one can say that incommensurability means incomparability with respect to some standard procedure that usually works. And therefore, the rhetorician Randy Harris, he said, it's a very nice phrase, incommensurability is a special category of failure, a failure of some standard procedures. And that is really the connotation of incommensurability one has to take very seriously. For Kuhn, incommensurability means that the standard procedure of rational theory comparison does not work, and the standard procedure being the comparison of the respective lists of solved problems. It's more than that. It's not just this comparison of lists of solved problems. Why is that the case? Well, there are again some sources. Not exactly the same set of problems is relevant for both theories. Not exactly the same set of concepts is relevant in both theories. And not exactly the same set of values is relevant for both theories. So one shouldn't be surprised that the standard procedure doesn't really work. So, thus, the consequence is that Kuhn only rejected one specific kind of rational theory comparison, not rational theory comparison altogether. And many people believe that Kuhn rejected rational theory comparison altogether, which is just wrong. Incommensurability does not imply incomparability, and therefore does not imply the irrationality of scientific development. Unfortunately, many people still believe that. If you look at the recent very good Kuhn literature, you find it that all the experts agree on this point. There are disagreements among the experts, I'm coming to them, but here is really agreement among the experts. Now here's a very nice one. The third source of confusion about Kuhn's incommensurability, it's self-refutation. And some philosophers thought that incommensurability is really self-refuting. Now here's an example, Hilary Putnam in Reason, Truth and History from 1981. The thesis of incommensurability is a self-refuting thesis. To tell us that Galileo had incommensurable notions and then to go on to describe them at length is totally incoherent. Now, putative reaction by historians, yes, we've always thought it's very difficult to talk to philosophers. Okay, there is a very simple solution to the puzzle, I mean now in terms that the philosophers will hopefully understand it. Of course you can use today's English as a meta-language in order to explain the incommensurable differences between today's English and Galileo's Italian. For the philosophers, Galileo wrote in Italian. So you have to distinguish that, right? And in a meta-language, of course, you can explain the differences. It's very easy then, and there's no self-refutation whatsoever. This is why Kuhn insisted that historians of science are often involved in some language teaching, because in order to understand what Galileo says, you have to understand his language, and therefore you have to be taught how his language works. So this is also a nice source of confusion. And now I come to the biggest one, the fattest one, world change. And in structure, you probably remember that. Otherwise, please read it in the latest editions, not page 150. The third and most important aspect of incommensurability is world change. Now, there have been several reactions to this claim, and I group them in three. The first one is a dismissal because of idealism. Right? You just dismiss that claim. That doesn't make sense. The second one is a diffusing of world change by a metaphorical or psychological reading. And the third one is a so-called neo-Kantian reading. And I want to treat these three strategies in turn. Now, Israel Scheffler, for instance, with reaction, a dismissal in Science and Subjectivity, the first really devastating reaction in book form on Kuhn's structure, it reads the following: I cannot myself believe that this bleak picture representing an extravagant idealism is true. So he just can't believe it, I can't believe it, okay? The full argument, and I'm a philosopher, so I reconstruct such a thing as a full argument. It contains four premises and one conclusion, and this is, of course, for my fellow philosophers, but the historians will also enjoy it, I hope. So it's four premises. The first premise is incommensurability encompasses world change, of course. The second is world change in revolutions, of course not in other forms of world change, implies idealism. And before I bring up the third premise, I must warn the historians, because there is a word in it that you may find rude, right? But it's a technical term in philosophy. There's even a book on that. Now, the third premise is idealism is bullshit. Bullshit is a technical term in philosophy. And the fourth one is then bullshit can be dismissed, from which you get the conclusion. I think it's not very, I had it formalized at home, but I don't formalize it here. A conclusion, incommensurability can be dismissed. It's a very straightforward argument, okay? Now, if you want to, it's not enough that the argument is correct, but you want to, of course, also discuss the soundness of the argument, in other words, the truth of the premises. Now, at premise P2, world change implies idealism. Yes, perhaps, but the question is what sort of idealism, okay? And premise P3, the high school version of idealism is certainly very questionable. Very questionable is the academic translation then of bullshit, okay? What reality is depends on how you think of it, period. That's the high school version, okay? And then the question, of course, is, was this Kuhn's view on idealism here? Let's see. Now, the second reaction to the world change talk is a metaphorical or psychological reading and therefore diffusing of world change. And the most recent example is Alexander Bird in the British Journal. The article appeared electronically 2 weeks ago, and only today in the morning I got the pages here, the page numbers, so it's really the very same day, the paper I'm referring to. The most recent example is the following, and it's my emphasis. And I read here the quote, "In summary, a change in paradigm can bring with it a range of important psychological changes that have cognitive and emotional consequences. It is these psychological changes that Kuhn is referring to with a metaphor of world change." By the way, there is another author, also Brad Ray, who'd written 4 weeks ago also about this metaphor, but I thought this isn't recent enough. I mean, philosophers don't read these old papers, 4 weeks old. Okay, so this is the first quote here, and the other quote is very simple. It's the same message. World change focuses on the psychological consequences of a scientific revolution. Now, the question is whether Alexander Bird is right here. And now I'm behaving more like a historian, and if you have to decide a historical question or some question, you go back to the sources, and unpublished sources are, of course, the standard things for historians. Now, I go to Kuhn in the unpublished Thalheimer lecture, Scientific Development and Lexical Change, November 1984 in Baltimore. I may add here, because Alexander Bird has repeatedly said and written that I exerted a very bad influence on Kuhn. And that can't have been by that time in 84, because I met Kuhn only in August of 84, so I can't have exerted that bad influences at that time already. So it's still original Kuhn and not the badly distorted Kuhn. Anyway, here is the quote. "When I first used the locution that world changes with a lexicon more than 20 years ago," so if you calculate, that was then structure, "I thought my remark metaphorical and the metaphor eliminable. Now I'm not so sure." Wait a minute, he's not so sure about what? About the eliminability, or that the remark is metaphorical? So you don't really know what he's saying. You say, okay, yeah, we know that, Kuhn. I mean, we don't understand what he's saying. Well, here are other quotes. "I shall then suggest that the reiterated assertion that the world changes with the structure of the lexicon used to describe it ought not to be heard simply as metaphor." So that's very clear. It ought not simply be heard as metaphor. And there are other things even more clearly. "I see no alternative to taking literally my repeated locution that the world changes with the lexicon." That's clear enough. Here's another one, a follow-up. "Is this an idealist position? Perhaps it is. But the idealism is then unlike any other of which I am aware." So the result of that is that the metaphorical psychological reading of world change does not capture Kuhn's intentions. That doesn't say that the intentions are not self-contradictory or whatever, but it certainly doesn't capture Kuhn's intentions. And therefore, here's another way of how to react to the world change locutions, the so-called neo-Kantian. And again, I go back to the sources from 1979 onward. Kuhn described his position as Kantian with temporarily mutable categories. Or in Peter Lipton's nice words, Kuhn's position is Kant on wheels. Now let me make one remark first, that this cannot be entirely correct. And this has the following reason. If you look at Kant, really what he does in his critical philosophy, Kant's forms of intuition and forms of thought, the categories, are responsible for the constitution of what physical things are in general, of spatio-temporal things. And Kant's form of intuitions, in other words, and thought, are constitutive of thinghood. That is what the Kantian theory is all about. Whereas, by contrast, Kuhn's world change does usually not affect thinghood itself. It only affects the existence, the qualities, and the relations of specific things, but their thinghood remains the same. So it's not really exactly the same, but that hasn't been noted in the literature, and I've noted it only very lately, very recently, I must admit. At any rate, but this is not so important because Kuhn's spirit is the same as Kant's. And now let's look at that a little. And that spirit is the following, and that may somehow, some of you may be a little bit confused about that. What we correctly take as objective reality is nevertheless somehow shaped by genetically subject-sided components. Genetically, not in the sense of biology, but that's origin on the subject side, as I call that. So what we correctly take as objective reality is nevertheless somehow shaped by genetically subject-sided components. That's the message of Kant, and that's the message of Kuhn. Now, does this make sense? I mean, you may say, no, that's self-contradictory. That doesn't make sense. It's completely inconsistent. Okay, perhaps it is. Here's an analogy. I'm leading you now in small steps to a possible understanding what that might mean. Here's the analogy, it's colors. Suppose colors as phenomenal qualities are secondary qualities. I know there's disagreement about colors, but the majority of people agree to that. They're an amalgam of genetically object-sided and genetically subject-sided components. That's the standard view. It's secondary qualities, something comes from outside, and the brain or the mind produces then phenomenal colors out of that. Are colors real, is the next question. Well, yes, very much so, if you want to buy a blue sweater or a red car. Imagine you ask your husband, please, darling, buy me a blue sweater, and he comes back with a green one. All right. And then he says, and you say, well, that's a green one, I asked for a blue one. Well, colors aren't real anyway. So. No, and a red car as well. So they are very much so, but not only in these everyday affairs. If you want to find out the colors of dinosaurs, for instance, and there were several papers in 2010 on the question, and they appeared in Nature and in Science, right? There are very important papers about the colors of dinosaurs, scientific things. And you can go further. Whenever you discuss the laws and regularities of colors, I mean, you take them as real. Look at the journal Color Research and Application. You find it there. I mean, they're taken as real. Okay, are colors real? Well, not really real if you focus on the purely object-sided component of colors, light of certain wavelength, reflect. Then you say, oh, the colors aren't really real. I mean, no, okay. Colors are only secondary qualities, less real than primary qualities. That's how we react to this secondary and primary qualities distinction. Now imagine the following, and that is a little difficult. Imagine that all observable and theoretical properties of things were secondary qualities as robust as colors, but without any access to the purely object-sided components, that means the corresponding primary qualities. Imagine that situation. We would probably take them as simply real, these properties, as really real. That would be our reaction, I guess. And this is the position that Kuhn had somehow in mind already in 1962. If you read the following sentence that you probably have never really understood, I haven't had my difficulties. Insofar as the scientists' only recourse to the world of their research engagement is through what they see and do, we may want to say that after a revolution, scientists are responding to a different world. That's the statement here. And what you see here is the only recourse to the world is through what they see and do. That means then, in this interpretation, the secondary qualities. And if that is the only recourse, then you take them for real. As probably in antiquity, when the distinction between secondary and primary qualities was there, but probably not applied to colors as far as I know, they took them as real. Of course, what else? As far as I can see, this position is indistinguishable from the position of perspectival realism or scientific perspectivism as developed by Ron Geary and also Paul Teller. And over the last 15 years or so, I discussed that with both of them. And I think now their position there is all humanly accessible reality is reality under a certain perspective. That's the main message of that sort of realism. And Geary used color vision as a prototype for scientific perspectivism, as I did first independently for the pertinent kind of neo-Kantianism. And this suggests the convergence of both positions. And I will probably switch labels and talk in the future about Kuhn's perspectival realism instead of neo-Kantianism. Why? This is probably more palatable in some parts of the world, including the United States. Okay, to conclude, let me mention that also during Kuhn's lifetime I've tried to resolve some of the confusions about his work, not only now, but also during his lifetime, and I've proof of that I try to show Kuhn the exact escape from many of the confusions, and it's here. Thank you very much.
Well, that concludes this evening's plenary session. Rather than having any Q&A here, we're hoping that the historians and philosophers might actually have something to talk about this evening in the reception that's in the 2 ballrooms next door. I might just point out that there will be a cash bar and light hors d'oeuvres, and the reception is being sponsored by University of Chicago Press on the 50th anniversary of Structure, and as you probably know, the press has just brought out a new edition, and with any luck, maybe that will grace the cover of our meeting together in 50 years if we're still having a liaison of sorts. So thank you for coming.